Hey guys, tonight we're climbing down into the strangest legal trapdoor in modern Western history, coverture, the rule that decided a wife stopped legally existing the moment she got married. Not sidelined, not outranked, erased, quietly folded into her husband until the law could no longer locate her as a separate person at all. If slow, factual, faintly maddening history is the thing that lowers your heart rate at night, go ahead and tap like and subscribe, but only if it genuinely helps you drift off never out of obligation. And a warm thank you to the listener who sent this one in. I hope you're already horizontal because tonight rather requires it. Tell me in the comments where you are and what the clock says where you're sitting. Somebody out there is hearing this at 4 inches the morning, and honestly, given the subject matter, lying flat in the dark feels like exactly the right response to it. Settle in the usual way. Lights low, a fan or some soft hum going somewhere in the room, covers drawn up over the shoulder, and maybe slide your hands underneath them while you still can, because in 1900 what a wife did with her hands was either her husband's legal property or a criminal matter, depending entirely on the afternoon. Did you ever stop to picture waking up and learning that your own signature meant precisely nothing? That money you earned with your own two hands could be collected, lawfully, by someone else, straight from your employer's palm. Could you survive a single Tuesday where opening a bank account, buying a winter coat on credit, and casting a vote were all, technically, against the law? What was the paperwork exactly? When a man printed a notice in the morning paper swearing off all responsibility for his wife's debts, while she was alive, well, and still out buying the groceries, was the asylum a hospital, or a quiet room a husband could arrange with one doctor and one signature? Did the physicians help? And why on earth did they hold so many opinions about your ovaries? And what, precisely, separated a wife from a widow such that some women in 1896 ran the numbers and chose the widow's odds on purpose? Congratulations. You've just woken up in England or America, somewhere around 1900. The coal fire wants banking, the wash copper is already ticking as it heats, and the version of you that could sign things, own things, and refuse things vanished the morning you got married. Good luck. You sign your name for the last time on the morning of your wedding. You don't know that yet. The clerk slides the register across the table, you write the name you have used your whole life, and somewhere between the ink drying and the walk back down the aisle, that name stops meaning what it meant. The law has a word for what just happened to you. The word is coverture, and it's been sitting in a book on a shelf since before you were born, waiting for exactly this. The word comes from the Old French for covered, as in, you are now covered, as in, someone else is standing over you legally, and the shadow they cast is your new legal existence. William Blackstone put it plainly in 1765 in his Commentaries on the Laws of England, a book every American lawyer also read, repeatedly, with great enthusiasm. He wrote that upon marriage, a wife's very being, her legal existence, is suspended, not diminished, not adjusted, suspended. The way you suspend a meeting, the way you suspend disbelief. You are still physically present. You just aren't there. Suspended, in practice, means you can't sign a binding contract in your own name. Not a lease, not a loan, not a bank account. If you want to open an account, your husband signs next to you, which is less of a co-signature and more of a permission slip from someone who now legally contains you. The bank isn't being rude. The bank is following the logic. There is, according to the law, no separate financial person here to hold the account. The coverture doctrine had a tidy philosophical explanation for this arrangement. Husband and wife become one legal person upon marriage. One. Singular. The explanation does not specify which one. It doesn't have to. Margaret, a seamstress in Leeds, figures this out on approximately day 3. Now, it's worth noting that not all women were equally caught. A widow had more legal capacity than a wife. An unmarried woman could own property, sign contracts, keep her wages. The law treated her as a complete person. The 1896 New York Times ran letters from women describing marriage as a legal demotion, which is an extremely dry way to describe what Blackstone had laid out in full a century earlier. Some women read those letters and stayed single on purpose. This was considered alarming. The thing is, coverture wasn't a medieval relic by 1900. It wasn't a dusty technicality lawyers cited once a decade. It was Tuesday. It was a woman named Edith walking into Marshall Fields and buying curtain fabric on her husband's account, not because she didn't have money, but because the account existed in his name and she existed, legally, as his agent. She's not a customer, she's a representative of the household, operating under what the law called agency of necessity. The fabric leaves the store under his name. So does she. A clerk named Josephine straightens a bolt of cloth across the counter, marks the total in the ledger under the husband's name, and hands Edith the receipt with the practiced neutrality of someone who has done this 10,000 times. The clerk's face is flat, professional, and entirely unsurprised. Edith takes the receipt. It does not have her name on it. Neither does anything else. The same husband whose name is on the account, whose name is on the deed, whose name is on the marriage register, that husband could also open a newspaper any given morning and publish a notice in the classified section announcing that he would not be responsible for his wife's debts. Routine. Matter of fact. The wording is calm, clerical, and faintly bored, sitting between the livestock notices and the shipping schedules. Someone read that over their tea. It was just news. You decide to open a bank account, which seems like a reasonable thing to want. You have money, the bank has a counter, and you walk in on a Tuesday morning fully prepared to hand the one to the other. The clerk is polite. He asks for your husband's signature. You explain that the money is yours, earned by you and carried here by you, and he nods along with the patience of a man who has had this exact conversation before and already knows how it ends. The money is yours in the sense that you are holding it. That's roughly where your claim ends. In most US states in 1900, a married woman cannot sign a binding contract in her own name. A bank account is a contract. The bank is not being difficult. The bank is being a bank in 1900, which is a very specific kind of difficult. Your wages, if you work, have the same problem. In several southern states, a husband can go directly to your employer and collect your paycheck himself. The employer is legally required to hand it over. You don't need to be present. You don't need to be informed. Your employer hands an envelope to a man, and the transaction is complete and correct, and the law is satisfied with itself. Your job technically continues. Missus. Hartley, the clerk's wife as it happens, stands 2 places behind you in the queue holding a small cloth purse and wearing the expression of someone who already knows she won't be opening an account either. She straightens her glove. She does this slowly, with great precision, the way a person adjusts something when they have nothing left to adjust. An unmarried woman, a widow, a spinster, a woman who has simply declined the arrangement, has more legal financial capacity than you do right now, standing in this bank with your own money in your hand. She can sign for the account, she can take the loan, she can hold the lease in her own name, and nobody asks her to fetch a man. You, the married one, the respectable one, the one who did everything correctly, cannot. Of course, the England and Wales Married Women's Property Acts of 1870 and 1882 did chip away at the edges. Wives could now own property. They could keep earnings from work begun after the marriage. Progress, technically. And yet the vast architecture of coverture was still standing, load-bearing and freshly painted. The Property Acts were less of a revolution and more of a skylight installed in a room with no doors. Back at the counter, the clerk slides the form across to you. There's a line for your husband's signature. It sits below yours, which is almost elegant in its condescension. Your name is on the page. It just doesn't count on its own, the way a footnote needs the text above it to exist at all. The footnote does not get to decide what the page says. The clerk is still nodding. He has a quality of infinite patience that belongs only to men who have the paperwork on their side. His manner is polite, pleasant, and completely immovable. You fold your money back into your bag. You walk out. The door closes with a small, satisfied click, like a ledger, snapping shut. You are paid on Friday. You have worked the full week, the mending, the piecework, the long hours bent over someone else's laundry, and the coins are counted into your palm at the end of it. They are not yours. In several states, your employer is permitted, and in some required, to hand your wages directly to your husband instead, and the law sees nothing strange in the arrangement. The money passes through your hands on its way to becoming his. Nobody at the counting table thinks to ask why. In practice, your husband doesn't need to be present. He doesn't need to do anything, really. He simply needs to exist as your husband, and the wages route themselves accordingly, the way water finds the lowest point in a room. In some southern states, the employer who handed the money to you instead of him was technically in breach. The paycheck had a preferred destination. You were not it. Now, If you happen to hold one of the better positions, a school teacher, a nurse, a clerk in the civil service, there is an additional consideration. Many of those jobs came with a marriage bar. The bar works like this. You are hired as a single woman, you do the work, you are promoted, and then you marry. The moment you marry, you resign. Not because your work has changed. Because your status has. The teaching posts in countless American school districts and the British civil service held this rule well into the 1940s, which is not ancient history. That's your grandmother's working life. Miss Dorothea Pratt, newly Mrs. Dorothea Hale, clears her desk on a Thursday. She sets her ink pen down in its holder with some precision. She does not slam it. Her face is composed, careful, and entirely empty. The precision is doing a great deal of work in that moment. The reasoning behind the bar was stated openly and without apparent embarrassment. A married woman's labour belonged to her household, not to her employer. You couldn't serve two masters. The household was the first master. The household had seniority. The irony being that the household paid nothing and the employer had been paying quite reliably, but the law found this distinction untroubling. If you earned money from writing, or from painting, or from performing on a stage, and you earned it under your maiden name or a pen name, the question of where that money legally belonged was not entirely settled, which meant it existed in a grey zone, which some women used with considerable ingenuity. George Eliot is not a pseudonym chosen at random. The name does specific legal and social work. It kept certain hands off certain earnings, at least for a while. Of course, the grey zone had edges. A wife who earned and quietly kept was not safe, just quieter. If the arrangement came to light, the money was still legally his. The ingenuity wasn't a loophole so much as a bet that nobody would look too closely. Many people didn't look. Some people did. And if you were injured, if an accident took your hand, or a runaway cart on Market Street broke your arm badly enough that you could no longer scrub and press and carry, the lawsuit that followed was your husband's to file, not yours. The loss being litigated was his. He had lost the use of your domestic labour, which was his property, and the court was prepared to compensate him for that. You sat at home with the broken arm. He sat in the courtroom with the grievance. The grievance, legally speaking, was his. You are a teacher, or a nurse, or a clerk in a quiet office, and you are getting married, which means you are about to be fired. Not for any failing of yours. The wedding itself is the disqualifying act. Your contract, or your school district, or the civil service rulebook contains a line stating plainly that a woman gives up her post the day she gains a husband, and the line is enforced without apology. You hand in your resignation the way you might hand over a coat at the door, expected, routine, and not really a choice. The reasoning, stated with a straight face by school boards and government offices alike, is that a married woman's attention belongs at home. Your competence isn't the question. Your marital status is the answer. A headmistress who has run her school for 12 years hands in her paperwork on a Friday, and on Monday there is a younger, unmarried woman at her desk who will eventually do exactly the same thing. Consider the British civil service, because it commits to the bit harder than almost anyone. The marriage bar there isn't a vague custom or a poorly enforced preference. It is policy. You sit a competitive examination, you pass it, you earn a position through demonstrated ability, and the morning after your wedding you are legally expected to vacate it. The examination you pass doesn't become invalid. Your skills don't expire. The service simply declines to keep employing someone who now has a husband nearby who is presumably capable of feeding her. The bar stays formally on the books in Britain until 1946. That is not a typo. Miss Pennington, one of the senior clerks on the second floor, has worked out a private calculation involving the precise order in which to do three things: announce her engagement, clear her desk, and begin looking for freelance copying work she can do at home under her maiden name, without anyone officially noticing. She does all three in the same week. She moves through the building with the brisk, composed, faintly defiant air of someone who has filed the necessary paperwork and intends to feel nothing about it until she reaches the omnibus. And the marriage bar isn't limited to government work. Teaching contracts in American school districts carry the same clause, sometimes written in, sometimes simply understood, and the understanding is that a married woman signals instability. She might get pregnant. She might defer to her husband on something. She has, in the view of the school board, introduced a second authority into her life, and institutions of 1900 are not prepared to compete with that. The logic has the texture of something someone said confidently in 1840 and nobody bothered to re-examine. A woman who is widowed can return to the same job. A woman who never married can hold the same post for 40 years. It is marriage, exactly and only marriage, that voids your professional existence. Widowhood restores it, which means your legal employability rises and falls with the current living status of your husband, which is a strange variable on which to build a career. Of course, some women do the math on this early. The 1896 New York Times runs letters from women describing marriage in terms that read less like romance and more like a cost-benefit analysis with a ceremony attached. One correspondent calls it a legal demotion with a cake. She is not wrong. The unmarried woman of 1900, the spinster, the figure of social pity, holds more legal capacity than her married friends. She can sign a contract, hold a lease, keep her earnings, maintain her post. She gives all of that up at the altar, and the transaction is considered a reasonable trade because the alternative is considered worse. The word for what you lose, legally speaking, is capacity. Not competence, capacity. The ability to act as a full legal person in commercial and professional life. You had it on Thursday. You don't have it on Saturday. The license you signed on Friday is the document that took it. You notice, slowly, that the widow 3 doors down can do things you cannot. She signs her own lease. She owns the little shop on the corner outright, in her own name, and the bank speaks to her directly across the counter. She was married once, the same as you, but her husband died and the law quietly handed her back something it had taken from you on your wedding day. You start doing the arithmetic, and the arithmetic does not flatter the institution you only just entered. The legal term for what you lost is capacity. The widow has it. The spinster on the next street has it. The woman who has never married, who everyone in your neighborhood finds slightly suspicious for reasons no one states plainly, she can open a bank account, sign a commercial lease, take out a loan, buy property. You cannot. Not without his signature alongside yours, confirming to whatever bank or solicitor or landlord is involved that yes, she is aware of this transaction. Yes, I permit it. You are not a signatory. You are a cosigner's dependent, a name that only counts when a second name agrees to count it. Picture what that looks like on a Tuesday. You need to renew the lease on the house. Your husband is travelling for work. The landlord requires a signed document. The document requires your husband's signature. Your husband is in Manchester. The lease expires Thursday. The landlord shrugs. The lease has opinions about Manchester. This is not a hypothetical. This is the ordinary mechanical friction of being a married woman in 1900, where every financial transaction requires a man to be physically present or reachable, and men are frequently neither. The 1870 Married Women's Property Act in England changed some of this. Then the 1882 Act changed more. You can now, technically, own property you inherited or earned after marriage. You can keep your post-marriage wages, on paper, but enormous territory remains. You still can't sue in your own name in many circumstances. You still can't serve on a jury. You still can't vote. The axe handed back a corner of the room and left the rest locked. Missus Brearley, the widow, knows exactly what she has. She stands behind her shop counter with the settled, upright and unbothered posture of someone who has stopped waiting for permission and found the experience quietly revolutionary. She writes the checks herself. She argues with the supplier herself, in a tone that is calm, exact and entirely unhurried. When the flower delivery comes up short, she is the one who sends it back, with a note. The note is firm. The note has her name at the bottom, not her late husband's, and that name carries legal weight. She's been doing this for 3 years. She has the look of someone who has accidentally discovered what competence feels like when no one is countersigning it. The widow's restored capacity is the whole argument in one body. Marriage took the contracts, the accounts, the standing, and her husband's death handed every piece of it back, untouched, as though it had only ever been on loan to him. The women who stayed single in this era weren't all doing it for love of independence. Some were doing it because they'd read the terms and conditions and found them hostile. You did not read the terms and conditions. Nobody handed them to you. They were just waiting, the way terms and conditions always are, for after the music stopped. And the widow keeps the shop hours she wants, and closes early on Thursdays because she likes Thursdays, and no one can legally stop her. You watch her pull down the shade at 2:30 on a warm afternoon and you think, she had to bury someone to get here. The law built that into the price. You want to go out, not far, to your sister's, across town, for the afternoon, and you find yourself doing something that would never once occur to a man preparing to leave his own home. You are asking. The asking is not written into any single law you could point to, but it lives in the space where several laws overlap, and that space is wide enough to keep you in the house if your husband decides it should. You reach for your hat, and you wait to be told whether you may wear it. Let's talk about restitution of conjugal rights. It's not rights, exactly. It's a court order. A husband whose wife has left, or simply refused to come home, can apply to a court to compel her return. The court can issue it. The court has issued it. The document has a name that sounds almost domestic, like something from a household manual, and what it does is tell you, in formal legal language, that you are required to go back inside. Until 1891, this was completely standard in England, not controversial, not remarked upon. A wife who left was a wife in breach of duty, and a husband who filed was a husband exercising a recognised remedy. The law called the home a shared domicile. The law was doing a lot of work with the word shared. How far that order could be pushed was, for a long time, an open question. A husband had the document. Whether he could enforce it with his own hands, whether he could simply hold you, was another matter, and in 1891, one man named Edmund Jackson would test exactly that. For now, all you need to know is that the order existed, and that nobody had yet drawn a firm line around how far it let a husband go. Now consider your afternoon trip. Your husband doesn't need to file a court order to keep you home. He doesn't need to lock the door. He simply needs to say no, and the architecture of the law agrees with him in enough places that the no tends to hold. Your legal domicile is his domicile. You don't choose it. If he moves, you move. If you decline to move, you are the one in breach. Missus. Holt, who lives 4 houses down and whose husband travels for work, moves through the week with a kind of practical freedom that she doesn't discuss out loud, because discussing it would invite someone to notice it. She carries a small notebook and writes down every errand she does while he's away, not because anyone asks, but because the habit has settled into her the way habits do when the alternative is being caught without an answer. She hands you a card for her dressmaker with the quiet, efficient, slightly conspiratorial air of someone who has learned to make transactions look like accidents. The hotel question is its own problem entirely. You can't travel far without encountering it. An unaccompanied woman requesting a room is, in the working assumption of most front desks in 1900, a woman with a reason to not be accompanied, and that reason, the desk assumes, is professional. Not professionally respectable. Several major hotels have standing policies. Others simply apply judgment, and the judgment lands the same way every time. You are travelling on your husband's behalf, or with his permission, or you are not checked in. The key stays behind the desk. The key has opinions. Of course, you could carry a letter. Some women do. A note from a husband explaining that his wife is travelling with his knowledge and for a legitimate purpose, which is the 1900 version of a permission slip, except the school is everywhere and never lets out. The letter doesn't always work. It works more than nothing. You fold it into your bag next to your handkerchief and your husband's name, which is also legally your name, which is also the name on the account, which is also the name the hotel will record if they let you in at all. You put on the hat. You are told you may. You leave. Whatever the reason, and the reasons are yours, you pack what you can carry and go back to your family, and for a few weeks you sleep somewhere that is not the marital home. Then the court order arrives. It is called restitution of conjugal rights, and it commands you to return to the house you left and the husband you left, on the grounds that your presence there is something he is legally owed. In 1891, in Lancashire, a man named Edmund Jackson decides not to wait for the paperwork to do the work for him. Edmund Jackson has already obtained the court order. Emily Jackson has already ignored it. So on a Sunday morning in Clitheroe, as Emily leaves her church, Edmund is waiting outside with a carriage and several friends. They lift her off the pavement, put her inside, and drive away. She is held in the family house for several weeks. The windows are not the kind that open easily. The doors are not the kind she controls. The house is quiet, orderly, and faintly suffocating. This is not, in the legal understanding of 1891, a kidnapping. It is a husband enforcing his rights. Emily's family applies to the Court of Appeal. The court, in a decision that surprises nearly everyone who has been following the case, rules that Edmund cannot do this. A husband cannot physically confine his wife. He can get the court order. He can ask, but he cannot lock the door. The newspapers are furious. Several editorial boards describe the ruling as an attack on the institution of marriage. The word anarchy appears in at least 2 of them, because the court has decided that a woman being held against her will in her own home is, in fact, being held against her will. Before the Jackson ruling, a husband who confined his wife was not committing false imprisonment. He was exercising a recognized domestic prerogative. A magistrate presented with Emily's situation before 1891 would have looked at the paperwork, confirmed the marriage certificate was valid, and sent her back. The court order had a name, a seal, and a filing fee. Your absence from the marital home is not a choice, it is a debt. Let's talk about what the restitution order actually does. It doesn't compel affection. It doesn't compel conversation. It compels physical presence in a specific building. You are legally required to be in the house. What happens inside the house is, in the eyes of the court, a domestic matter. The order is essentially a location requirement, the original ankle monitor, except it covers the entire property and comes with a kitchen, a magistrate named Mr. Cadwallader, and there is always a Mr. Cadwallader somewhere in these proceedings, writing in a hand that is cramped, careful, and faintly pleased with itself, reviews the paperwork with the expression of a man who finds everything in order. The marriage license is present. The desertion is documented. He stamps the form. He does not ask why you left. The form has no field for that. The Jackson ruling chips something off. It doesn't remove the restitution order from the law that stays on the books in England until 1970, and in several American states considerably longer. What it removes is the enforcement mechanism. A husband can still apply for the order can still be granted, but if you ignore it, the most he can do is use your continued absence as grounds for a divorce, which, in 1891, still requires him to prove adultery as well, so the divorce is not straightforward either. The law giveth, and the law immediately maketh things complicated. The newspapers settle down eventually. The editorial boards move on to other threats to civilization. Emily Jackson goes somewhere her husband is not, which is now, technically, legal. Edmund presumably finds other things to do with his Sundays. The carriage is returned. The friends are not mentioned again in the record. You go shopping. The department store is glorious, Macy's or Marshall Field's or Harrods if your afternoon is grand enough, and you choose gloves, a length of cloth, a hat for the season. At the counter you give your name for the account, and the clerk writes down a different one, your husband's. The account has always been in his name, because the store, like the law behind it, understands the transaction happening here to be his, conducted through you, the way a hand conducts the wishes of the arm it hangs from. The legal term for what you are doing is agency of necessity. You are his agent. You have spending power without an account, purchasing authority without financial personhood, the ability to choose without the standing to own. You can spend, you cannot keep. The distinction is treated as a feature, not a problem. Spend badly, and the arrangement shows its teeth. If your purchases exceed what a court later decides was necessary for the household, your husband is not obligated to pay. He can walk into the offices of the newspaper, the same paper you read over breakfast, and place a classified advertisement announcing, in calm newsprint, that he is not responsible for any debts his wife may incur. This is a routine thing. These notices appear in the same column as livestock auctions and rooms to let. The wife is not notified. The wife is not consulted. She simply becomes, as of that morning's edition, a transaction risk, repriced overnight, like a stretch of road the council has quietly decided to stop maintaining. Harold Finch, clerk at a dry goods counter on the high street, has a small book where he records these notices. His manner is calm, methodical, and entirely incurious. He doesn't consult it dramatically. He just glances at it before he writes, the way a man checks the weather before leaving the house. If your name is in the book, your husband's name technically, the pen hesitates. Then moves to the cash column instead. The restitution of conjugal rights order leaves a husband with a court document, but no physical enforcement after 1891. The store account is what the system runs on instead. You cannot leave without consequences because you cannot bank. You cannot bank without a co-signature. The co-signature belongs to the same person you might be leaving, which means the door out is locked with a pen you are not allowed to hold. If you earn money from teaching, from writing, from taking in laundry, that money is also his in most US states. In several southern states, your employer is legally required to hand your wages directly to your husband if he shows up and asks. He doesn't need to explain. He doesn't need to sign anything. He just needs to arrive before you do. Your employer complies because the law requires it, and because arguing with a man about his wife's paycheck on a Tuesday morning is nobody's preferred Tuesday, and yet you do need money. The house requires coal and flour and the occasional length of wool that isn't a luxury regardless of what the newspaper notice column implies. So you spend, carefully, within whatever margin he has decided is reasonable, as his agent, under his name, in stores that understand precisely what arrangement they are participating in and have never once found it worth mentioning. The practical shape of this, daily, is less like oppression and more like logistics with no emergency exit. You know what the account holds. You know what the household needs. You know the gap between them and you navigate it, the way you navigate a room in the dark, by memory, by habit, and by never quite touching the walls. You buy the groceries. Coal, flour, a joint of meat for Sunday, the ordinary freight of keeping a household alive, and you buy all of it on credit extended not to you but through you. The law calls this agency of necessity. You are presumed to be acting as your husband's agent, purchasing the necessaries of the home he is obliged to maintain, which hands you real power over the daily money and no standing whatsoever to call any of it your own. You spend his credit with great competence. You simply never get to hold any. The Harrods account is his. The Marshall Fields account is his. The ledger at the corner butcher is his. You walk in, you are recognized. You are served with warmth and efficiency, and the transaction is recorded against a name that isn't yours. You're basically an authorized user on someone else's credit card, except the card is your entire legal identity, and there is no customer service line to call when something goes wrong. Going wrong has a particular shape. Say you run up a bill at the draper's, fabric, ribbon, a pair of gloves, and your husband decides he doesn't want to pay it. He takes out a classified ad. This is a real, routine thing. A man named Alderman Whitby, or something equally municipal, places 4 lines in the morning paper announcing that he will no longer be responsible for any debts incurred by his wife, Mrs. Whitby. From this date forward, other men read this over their kippers and nod faintly. The draper reads it and writes off the debt. You read it from across the breakfast table, if you are permitted to read the paper at all. The ad has the cool, formal and faintly triumphant tone of a corporate press release announcing a restructuring, and the thing being restructured is you, Mrs. Pendleton, behind the dry goods counter, hands you your parcel with the practiced efficiency of someone who has watched this particular theatre before. Her manner is brisk, courteous, and entirely discreet. She doesn't comment. She writes the figure in the book. Her handwriting is impeccable. The book does not belong to her either. There is, of course, a fail-safe built in, and it favours him. If you buy something the courts later decide wasn't a necessity, something decorative, something personal, something that could not be argued to serve the household's survival, your husband may contest the debt entirely. He stands in front of a judge and argues that the silk was not flour, that the sheet music was not coal, that a man should not be bankrupted by his wife's taste. The definition of necessity is his to argue and the courts to decide. The line between what you needed and what you merely wanted is drawn by people who don't do the shopping. If you are injured, say a carriage accident leaves you bedridden for 6 months, unable to cook or clean or manage the house, your husband is the one who sues for damages, not you. The loss is legally his. He has been deprived of the services of his wife, which is a category of property damage the law takes seriously. The suit is called loss of consortium. Your broken arm is the occasion. His inconvenience is the injury. You are, in this framing, something between a housekeeper and a load-bearing wall, and the structural damage is assessed from the outside. The same logic runs in reverse. You cannot sue anyone for interfering with your own interests inside the marriage, because your interests and your husband's interests are, by law, the same interests. Coverture again. One legal person. His. Back at the counter, your order is complete. The coal merchant writes the delivery for Tuesday. The flour is wrapped in paper. The joint of meat is tucked under your arm. You walk home through November air that smells of chimney smoke and horse and wet stone, carrying everything the household needs. On credit you have managed and arranged, and will spend the rest of the week accounting for. The account book is in your handwriting. The account is not in your name. You are very good at this. You have to be. You open the newspaper one morning and find your marriage in the classified pages. Not by your name, perhaps, but the form is familiar to everyone who reads the column. a husband announcing, in paid print between the lost dogs and the rooms to let, that he will no longer be responsible for any debts contracted by his wife. It is a public revocation of the credit you were only ever borrowing in the first place. Once it runs, the merchants read it too, and the account you have been keeping for the household quietly stops working in your hands. The notice costs about $1. The marriage cost considerably more. Neither transaction required your signature. What the notice actually does is narrow. It doesn't end anything legal. You're still married, still his, still without independent standing before any court or bank. What it ends is the fiction of agency, the working arrangement where a shopkeeper extends credit on the assumption that a husband will eventually pay. The shopkeeper has now been officially informed otherwise. He folds the newspaper, sets it beside his till, and the next time you come in for flour or ribbon or coal, he looks at you with the particular expression of a man who has recently been educated. Mr. Crew, the grocer on the corner, has the notice pinned to the wall behind him with a brass tack. He didn't have to do that. He chose to. You didn't open the account. You couldn't have. A married woman couldn't sign a binding contract in her own name, which meant the account at the grocer's, the account at the draper's, and the account at the coal merchant's all belonged to your husband in the same way that a library belongs to the building. You were the borrower. He was the library. The notice is the library closing early and posting new hours that don't include you. Of course, you still need flour. The household doesn't pause because the classified section has opinions. You can pay cash if you have cash, which requires him to give it to you, which requires him to be findable and willing, which is its own small adventure depending on the week. In several American states, you couldn't even hold your own wages. An employer was legally required to hand your paycheck directly to your husband if he showed up and asked. He didn't have to ask nicely. He just had to show up. The notice in the classifieds is, in a way, the tidiest version of this arrangement. At least it's legible. At least it runs once and is done. The subtler version, the one that doesn't require print, is the slow withdrawal of credit that happens whenever a husband simply stops endorsing debts he considers unnecessary. No announcement. The account just develops a new coldness, a hesitation at the counter. The grocer's tack is almost generous by comparison. At least you know. Meanwhile, the notice itself has a social life beyond commerce. Neighbours read it. Your mother-in-law reads it, possibly with satisfaction. The woman 2 streets over reads it and files the information away with the careful, neutral, faintly satisfied air of someone updating a municipal record. The classified column is, in its way, a marriage status ticker. Domestic arrangements aired between advertisements for patent medicines and second-hand pianofortes. There is something almost elegant about its efficiency, an entire marital breakdown summarized in 3 lines, prepaid, submitted before noon for the evening edition. You don't publish a corresponding notice. There is no corresponding notice. The column has no mechanism for a wife to announce that she will not be responsible for her husband's decisions. That's not a service the newspaper provides. You go to register to vote. You are an adult. You live in the district. You can read the form and sign the line. And you present yourself at the table where men are doing exactly that with no trouble at all. You are turned away. Not arrested. Not yet. Simply refused. Your name left off the roll as a matter of course, because the roll was never meant to hold it. The clerk barely looks up while he tells you. He has had a whole century of practice at not looking up. If you actually vote, not just try, but vote, the federal government has opinions about that. Susan B. Anthony voted in the 1872 presidential election in Rochester, New York. She was arrested 2 weeks later under the Enforcement Act of 1870, tried without being permitted to speak in her own defense, convicted, and fined $100. She declined to pay. The judge declined to jail her, which was tactically unfortunate for him, because jailing her would have created an appeal, and an appeal might have gone somewhere. He knew that. She knew that. The $100 sat between them like a very principled standoff, and she left the courtroom having paid nothing and established very little, legally speaking, but having been absolutely impossible about it the whole time. In 1900, no woman votes in a national election anywhere in the English-speaking world. New Zealand had granted the vote in 1893. Australia followed in 1902, with exceptions so broad they swallowed several people whole. But the 2 largest democracies, the ones most vocal about liberty, are still working up to it. Britain won't get there, even partially, until 1918. The US, won't reach the 19th Amendment until 1920, and even then it arrives with informal enforcement in the American South that works like a second, unwritten law. Now, some women do vote in 1900. In local elections, school board elections, in the 4 western U.S. states that have extended suffrage at the state level: Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, Idaho. You can vote on whether to fund the schoolhouse, but not on who runs the country that contains the schoolhouse. The distinction has its own architectural elegance. It's a very small room with a very large door in front of it. The clerk at the registration table isn't hostile necessarily. He's not performing cruelty. He's performing a routine so old it has worn grooves into the floor, patient, settled, and entirely incurious. Constance, standing across the table from him with her name ready, is not a problem he needs to solve. She is a situation that has already been solved by Blackstone in 1765 and by every county registrar since. Her legal existence is suspended. The form has no line for a suspended existence. He tips his head toward the door with the conviction of a turnstile, which has also never once wondered who it is keeping out. And the refusal has a second page, if the clerk cares to turn to it. He reaches under the table for the bound statute, the one with the cracked spine and the ribbon marker gone grey at the edge, and lays it open on the desk between you. His finger goes down the column to a heading that reads Election Offences and stops on the line just beneath it. It is the same line, in the same column, that governs the man who stuffs a ballot box under 4 different names. Your attempt and his fraud share a paragraph. The fine set in the margin is $100, the figure Anthony declined to pay, and it is the figure the statute keeps for both of you. He turns the book back around and closes it. It was never written to tell you apart from the cheat. Anthony died in 1906, 14 years before the amendment, bearing her argument past. She knew the timeline. At her last public appearance, she said, "Failure is impossible," in the flat declarative tone of someone who has been turned away from enough tables to have stopped being surprised by them and started being certain instead. The clerk at the register didn't look up. She didn't look away. You decide to vote anyway. In 1872, in Rochester, New York, a woman named Susan B. Anthony does exactly this, walks into the polling place, casts a ballot in a presidential election, and goes home. The arrest comes later. She is tried under a federal statute, convicted, and fined $100 for the crime of having voted while being a woman. The act of marking a ballot, so ordinary that most men forget they have done it by supper time, is for you a matter the courts are entirely prepared to take seriously. The fine is $100. She declines to pay it. The court, faced with the choice of imprisoning a woman who has just become a national embarrassment and thereby creating a martyr, or simply letting the fine sit there unpaid and quietly pretending the matter is closed, chooses the second option. The $100 is never collected. It is still not collected. Some debts have opinions about themselves. Look at the map in 1900 and most of it is empty. New Zealand granted women the vote in 1893. Australia followed in 1902 with a significant asterisk. Aboriginal women are not included, which suggests that the reformers had a fairly specific idea of which women they meant. In the United States, Wyoming, Colorado, Utah, and Idaho have extended suffrage at the state level. That's 4 states out of 45. The rest of the map is blank. In Britain, the map is entirely blank. You do not vote in a national election anywhere in the English-speaking world in 1900 unless you are in one of those 4 western states, and even then your county clerk has made his feelings about the situation fairly evident through the arrangement of the furniture. A woman named Matilda Joslyn Gage, who has been arguing this since before Anthony's arrest, sits down and calculates, some years earlier, that women pay taxes on property they are not legally permitted to vote about how it is spent. The government accepts the money. The government does not accept the vote. The government sees no inconsistency here. The government is comfortable, settled, and entirely disinclined to stand up from a very good chair. A woman named Charlotta, a schoolteacher in a northern state, watches the men in her county walk to the polling place every 2 years and back again. She is more educated than most of them. She reads more, argues more carefully, is better acquainted with the candidates' positions. She knows this. The men know this. None of this is legally relevant. She goes home and grades papers instead. The men she outreads will decide the election without her. The argument against women voting, stated plainly, is that the husband already votes for the household, and so a wife voting would simply double count the household's ballot, which is a redundancy the Republic cannot afford. This argument assumes the wife and husband agree on everything, which anyone who has ever watched two people try to order a single entree at a restaurant will recognize as optimistic. The argument also assumes the husband is voting at all, which in several counties he demonstrably is not, but the logic does not update for new information. It rarely does. By 1900, the suffrage movement has been formally organized for over 50 years. The Seneca Falls Convention was 1848, and the 19th Amendment is still 20 years away. The movement is not young. It is not new. It is not a fringe position. It is a position that has been argued, petitioned, litigated, and publicly marched for across 3 generations of women who are now dead without having voted once. That's not a metaphor for anything. That is just what happened. You consider running for office. The thought is not absurd on its face. You have opinions, a district, and the same literacy as the men whose names already appear on the ballot, so you look into what it would actually take to put your own name beside theirs. The answer is that you cannot. The nomination papers will be refused, and if you press the matter, the pressing itself can become the offence. The seat in the State House, the seat in Parliament, the desk in the chamber. Each one carries a quiet rule that you are not the kind of person who sits in it. Not eligible does not announce itself in practice. It isn't a sign on the door. It's a clerk who sets your paperwork to one side with the gentle finality of a maitre seating you at no table at all. It's a returning officer who explains patiently that the form requires a qualified elector's signature, and you are not a qualified elector, and therefore the form is, administratively speaking, not a form. The whole thing runs on the same logic as a door that has no lock because no one bothered to add a handle either. The legal foundation under your feet here is old. The 1876 Supreme Court case Minor v. Happersett already decided that citizenship does not automatically mean suffrage, and the ruling sits there now like furniture nobody wants but nobody moves. Virginia Minor tried to register to vote in Missouri, sued when she was refused, and reached the highest court in the country, which told her unanimously that yes, she was a citizen, and no, that did not help her. The court was thorough. It was also very comfortable with this conclusion. Now, standing for office is a separate problem stacked on top of the first one. Voting and candidacy are distinct legal acts, and in 1900 you are barred from both, which is efficient in a grim way. You can't vote for the seat, and you can't hold it. The State House has achieved a kind of frictionless exclusion. It doesn't need 2 locks when neither door opens. Victoria Woodhull ran for President of the United States in 1872. She did it anyway. She named Frederick Douglass as her running mate without his consent, published a newspaper, declared her candidacy, and was in jail on Election Day on charges of sending obscene material through the mail. The obscene material being a newspaper article about a prominent minister's affairs, which tells you something about whose reputations the Comstock framework was actually protecting. She got no electoral votes. She spent Election Day in a cell. She had, in the terminology of the day, made herself inconvenient. The argument against women in elected office runs in a familiar loop. You lack the rational detachment that governance requires. You are suited to the domestic sphere. Your husband already represents you. This last one is a particular triumph of circular reasoning. The same logic that explains why you don't need a vote also explains why you don't need a seat, which explains why you don't need a voice, which brings you neatly back to the kitchen, where the coal range has been waiting and is, at least, not dismissing your legal standing. Margaret Wintringham, elected to Parliament in 1921, Constance Markievicz, elected in 1918 but refused to take her seat. The first women to break through do it in the generation after yours, and they do it against the accumulated weight of every nomination form quietly set to one side. Your form, your mother's form, the form of every woman who reached the table before you and was waved off it. The desk in the chamber was always wide enough, sturdy enough, and ordinary enough to hold a woman. That was never the issue. The issue was practical. Not one hand in that room would pick up your paper and read your name aloud. You fold your papers. The thought was not absurd. It simply had nowhere to go. You learn, the way wives learn these things, that there is no version of the word no that the law will recognize inside your own marriage. The principle is old. A jurist named Matthew Hale wrote it down in 1736, and the courts have leaned on his single sentence ever since. holding that by marrying you gave a consent you are not afterward permitted to withdraw. There is no charge to bring. There is no statute to point to. The home the law works so hard to keep you inside offers you, on this one matter, nothing at all. Hale's logic is simple, in the way that a locked door is simple. A wife, upon marriage, gives irrevocable consent. Irrevocable is the working word. They find it sitting there in a 1736 treatise, and treat it the way you'd treat load-bearing furniture, useful, in place, not to be moved. The marriage certificate is, in this reading, a one-time agreement that covers everything subsequently, forever, without amendment. It's the most comprehensive contract you'll ever sign, and you sign it without knowing that clause is in there. On an ordinary Tuesday, this means there is a specific kind of harm with no name, no form, and no remedy. You can't call a constable. You can call a constable. The constable will explain, with some embarrassment, that he has no jurisdiction inside a marriage. The marital exemption isn't a technicality around the edges of the law. It is the law. Hale didn't write a footnote. He wrote doctrine, and doctrine is what everyone has been reciting for 160 years. A clerk named Ambrose, filing case notes downtown, has more paperwork on a stolen bicycle than on this. The asymmetry runs the other way too, and it runs completely. A wife who strikes her husband, even once, even in response to something, faces an assault charge. The courts will hear that case. There is a form for that case. The husband, meanwhile, operates under a principle called moderate chastisement, which is exactly what it sounds like, and which is treated, legally, as a domestic matter rather than a crime, private, ordinary, and entirely beneath the court's notice. The word moderate is doing significant work in that phrase. It always is. Nobody has formally defined it, which means it defines itself in practice, which means it expands to fit the room. Bradley v. State, 1824. A Mississippi court takes the position that wife-beating is undesirable but declines to interfere. State v. Hussey, 1852. Similar architecture, similar conclusion. The cases where a court pushes back exist, but they're outnumbered by the cases where the court simply declines to enter the house. The house is, legally, his. The law has strong feelings about property. The loss of consortium suit is the detail that sits with you. If someone injures you so severely you can no longer perform your domestic duties, your husband is the one who brings the lawsuit, not you. Him. The legal theory is that your labour, your cooking, your cleaning, your physical presence in the house belongs to him, and the damage done is damage to his household. You are the injured party in every practical sense. The court papers list him. You are, legally, the asset that was impaired. Of course, the remedy improves nothing about your broken arm. It just clarifies, in formal language, whose inconvenience the court considers primary. You should know how this ends, because it ends after you. The exemption you live under survives in England and Wales until 1991, RVR. Not 1891, not 1791, 1991. A court decides, for the first time, that Hale's 1736 sentence is not actually a permanent feature of English law. The US states holding the same exemption let go of it just as slowly, amending their statutes one by one, each amendment its own small, late, grudging argument about whether the 1736 position was ever reasonable, and they land on different answers at different speeds. The last ones take their time. The doctrine you are stuck inside is old, and old things are slow to move, even when the furniture was never load-bearing to begin with. You are tired one week, or ill, or simply finished, and you let the housework go. The dishes stack. The range goes cold. The mending sits untouched in its basket. This, it turns out, is a matter the law has firm opinions about. A husband is legally entitled to what the courts call consortium, your company, your cooperation, and the domestic services of your two hands, and a wife who withholds the cooking and the cleaning can find the failure named aloud in a courtroom. The chores you skipped are not chores anymore. They are evidence. Consortium covers more than your company at dinner. It's the fire laid in the morning, the water heated and carried, the bread baked and the lard rendered and the children bathed and the linens changed and the kitchen range, a large, black, and coal-fed machine that hates you specifically, coaxed back to temperature every few hours, or the whole system goes cold and sullen. Mrs. Beeton, in her book of household management, lays this out cheerfully across 900 pages. She notes that a proper middle-class kitchen requires at least 2 servants, which is basically a Michelin kitchen brigade, except it is one woman and a range that hates her. You are one woman. There is no brigade. Monday is wash day. The copper tub goes on before 6. By 10 in the morning, the kitchen is full of steam and the specific smell of boiling wool, hot and animal and slightly sulphurous, like a sheep expressing its feelings directly into your sinuses. You wring the wet clothes by hand. Your arms ache from the wrist to the shoulder. The floor is wet. The windows run. This is Monday. Tuesday is ironing. Wednesday, the range needs blacking. Thursday exists, presumably, but you are too tired to confirm it. If you stop doing this, if you leave, or refuse, or simply sit down and do not get up, your husband can bring an action for restitution of conjugal rights. The court issues an order requiring you to return to the house and resume your duties. The duties are not spelled out in the order. They don't need to be. Everyone understands what the order means. It means the range, and the copper tub, and the 900 pages of missus. Beaten, and you, in the kitchen, by 6. A court clerk named Gerald Pemberton processes the paperwork with the expression of a man filing a routine inventory adjustment. He stamps the form. He files the carbon copy. He does not look up. The consortium framework gets particularly tidy when the injury comes from outside the marriage. If someone out there hurts you, a horse, a cart, a piece of unsafe scaffolding, so badly that you can no longer keep the house, your husband is the one who sues, not you. The loss is legally his hot meals, his clean shirts, his managed household, gone because of the scaffolding. The court agrees this is a loss worth compensating. You are, in this framing, something between an employee and a fixture, capable of being damaged, but not yourself the party who holds the claim. The scaffolding hurt you. The law hurt him. Of course, if you injure yourself through your own labour, wringing the wash until your wrist gives, hauling coal until your back goes, that is simply Monday. There is no form for that. The law does not have opinions about Monday injuring you. It has opinions about you failing Monday. And yet the labour itself is invisible in one very specific way. It produces no wages. You can't be paid for consortium. The courts made this clear when anyone tried to argue otherwise. The work you do is the consideration you gave when you married, the exchange already settled, the contract already closed, the price already named and agreed to, before you understood entirely what was on the list. The list was long, the list was binding, and the list was kept somewhere you were never shown. Nobody handed you the list. You are hurt, a fall on the ice, a careless cart in the street, a break that will not let you lift or scrub for months. Someone is at fault, and there will be a lawsuit, and the lawsuit will be filed. Just not by you. When a third party injures a wife badly enough that she can no longer keep the house, the law treats the loss as her husband's to recover, on the reasoning that the working of your hands belonged to him in the first place. You are the one in bed with the splint. He is the one the court records as the injured party. Your labour is an asset of the marriage. The marriage's assets belong to him. The husband is therefore the plaintiff. You are, in the legal sense, the asset. Not the party, the asset. Martha Holloway sets a cold compress on your wrist without looking up. She has done this before, for herself, and she doesn't discuss it. The compress is damp and smells of vinegar. She tucks the cloth under the edge of the splint with the practiced, careful, and entirely unhurried confidence of someone who learned not to ask questions about the paperwork. The suit names him. Your cooking, your scrubbing, your mending, your management of the household's daily operations, all of it lands on a single damages claim, filed by a man who cannot find the laundry and has eaten cheese for 4 days. The court calls this a grievous injury. To him. You get the vinegar compress. The damages the court might award, and sometimes does, are calculated based on the replacement cost of your household services. Economists in later decades will try to assign this a number, and the number will be alarming. In 1900, no one assigns it a number, because doing so would require acknowledging that the work had been happening all along. It's easier to notice the work only once it stops. This is, incidentally, also how most people treat plumbing. Of course, none of this means the husband necessarily recovers anything. Courts are inconsistent. Juries have varying views on how to price a wife. But the structure of who sues, and why, and on whose behalf, that part is settled. You don't have standing to sue for the loss of your own labour. You didn't own it. He did. You are, to use the legal vocabulary of the period, the instrument that produced the loss. Instruments don't file suits. They're filed about. The cart driver, for his part, is probably just relieved the lawsuit doesn't name him in a criminal proceeding. He pays a fine calibrated to the husband's inconvenience, a sum that arrives with all the moral weight of a late library notice. Your arm heals, or it doesn't, and either way the court has moved on. Martha changes the compress. The vinegar smell lingers. The splint has opinions about whether you'll be wringing laundry by Monday, and those opinions are not encouraging. The same shape holds when a wife dies from the injury. The wrongful death suit is, again, the husband's to file, for the loss of her services and companionship. Her estate, if she has one, she often doesn't, for reasons we've established at length, is a separate matter. What the court primarily measures is what she was worth to him as a functioning household unit. It's a less Michelin kitchen brigade way of thinking about a person, and more a way of pricing a piece of farm equipment that has stopped running. You are not farm equipment. The law in 1900 would like to politely disagree, or at least defer the question until the next legislative session, which will not address it. You raise a hand to your husband, to stop a blow, to answer one, it does not much matter which, and you discover the law has been waiting for this with far more interest than it ever showed in the blows aimed at you. A wife who strikes her husband can be prosecuted for assault, plainly and seriously, even when the striking was defence. The same courts that treated a husband's violence as a kind of private domestic weather treat yours as a matter of public order. The asymmetry is not hidden in any fine print. It is simply the rule. Moderate correction is not a guideline. It's a legal term, and it has a history of being cited in courtrooms with complete seriousness. The common law principle held that a husband had the right to physically correct his wife, provided he did so within what the courts considered reasonable measure. A case in 1824, Bradley v. 5, State, pushed back on this, and another in 1852, State versus Hussey, moved further still, but the erosion was slow and uneven across jurisdictions, and the spirit of the thing persisted long after the formal doctrine was technically retired. What practically happened in 1900 is that a husband who hit his wife was rarely prosecuted, and if he was, fines were small enough that a county judge could deliver one while maintaining eye contact with the defendant the entire time. Mrs. Thorne sets the summons on the desk with 2 fingers, the way you set down something wet. She does not look at you while she explains the options, her manner brisk, formal, and entirely practiced. There are 2. The first involves patience. The second involves more patience. She straightens the paper and slides it toward you, and there's a pause in which the whole room seems to be waiting to see if you'll ask a follow-up question. You don't. You already know there isn't one. The actual court record, when it exists at all for domestic cases, contains the husband's account and a physician's note about the injury and not much else. Your account, if you gave one, is often described as excited or contradictory, which are the words records used when they meant inconvenient. The husband, meanwhile, is described as provoked, or that the matter was domestic in nature, a phrase that in 1900 functioned as the legal equivalent of a closed door, domestic in nature, a finding that clears the docket and sends you both home. Back home, specifically. The math is pointed. Because if you then raise your hand, if you defend yourself the following week, or the one after, you are not meeting force with force in the eyes of the court. You are introducing a new incident. The prior incidents have been disposed of, domestic in nature. This new one is you, striking your husband, who is a man, which is an assault, which is a crime, which is on the record. The record the court will consult next time. The logic of it moves in one direction only, and that direction is not toward you. The phrase rule of thumb, tied to wife-beating statutes, turns out to be largely invented. Legal historians find no English statute actually encoding a thumb's width of stick, but the underlying principle it was describing was real enough that the legend stuck, which is its own kind of documentary evidence. The rule didn't need to be written down. It was performed consistently enough to seem like furniture. The kind of furniture that's always been there and that no one particularly wants to explain. What you can do, technically, is leave. You can walk out. What you discover when you do is that the house, the children, the money, and the legal existence you maintained during the marriage all belong to a person who is still inside. That part has been covered already, in considerable detail, by everything this marriage has taught you so far. Leaving solves the immediate problem in the way that stepping off a boat solves the problem of the boat. You are out of the boat. You are also in open water, in your good shoes, a long way from any shore that has agreed to take you. You may have heard the story about the thumb, that a husband was once permitted by law to beat his wife with a stick no thicker than it. Historians will tell you the specific statute is mostly a myth, and they are right, which is somehow less of a comfort than it should be. The thing sitting underneath the myth was real. English common law recognized a husband's right to the moderate correction of his wife, and where the courts had stopped endorsing it out loud, they mostly just stopped prosecuting it instead. The stick was never the point. The permission was. Moderate is a word. A magistrate in 1900 measures without a ruler on his bench. He has a sense of proportion, and his sense of proportion is inherited, settled, and entirely unexamined, shaped by the same culture that wrote the law in the first place. Bradley versus State, an 1824 Mississippi case, said a husband's right of chastisement was limited to cases of emergency. State v. Hussey, 1852, said the courts would not inquire into domestic disputes at all, except in cases of permanent injury. These cases were considered progressive. They were, in their way, a very American response to not wanting to deal with it. The asymmetry has a shape you can hold. You raise a hand to your husband, in self-defense, in the middle of something you did not start, and you have committed assault. He hits you first, and the prior incident is filed under domestic in nature, which is the legal equivalent of a drawer that only opens from the outside. Your defense exists. It just doesn't have anywhere to go. Miss Coward sets down her pen when you come in and looks at you with the specific expression of a woman who has heard this before and written none of it down. If someone outside the marriage hurts you badly enough that you can't cook, can't clean, can't fulfill what the law calls the duties of consortium, your husband is the one who sues. The claim is his. The loss is legally his. You are the injured party in every physical sense, and you have no standing in the room where the matter is decided. The suit is styled as a property dispute, and the property is your labour, and you are the property. Nobody in the courtroom says this out loud. They don't have to. Of course, the fines existed. A husband convicted of excessive beating, which required the injuries to be genuinely significant, witnessed, reported, and prosecuted, a combination rarer than a Tuesday that felt like a Wednesday, might pay a nominal amount, 2 shillings, 5 shillings. The fine had the moral weight of a parking ticket, except parking tickets went up with repetition. These did not reliably do that. The language in the court records is worth reading slowly. Moderate, correction, necessary discipline, domestic in nature. The words are doing a great deal of work, and they are doing it very quietly, like a draft coming under a door you thought you'd sealed. The legal framework isn't announcing itself. It is simply present, the way coal smoke is present in a house, not because anyone lit it specifically to fill the room, but because the room was built around the fire. And yet, on paper, a wife had a remedy. You could apply for a separation order. You could leave. What you could not do, in many jurisdictions, was take your children when you went. What you could not do was sign a lease on a new address without your husband's co-signature, which is the kind of detail that makes the word remedy feel like it needs quotation marks. The remedy had prerequisites. The prerequisites included the person you were leaving. You want a divorce, and you find that the door out of a marriage is a different size depending entirely on who is standing in front of it. In England, after 1857, a husband seeking divorce needs to prove one thing, that his wife committed adultery. A wife needs to prove the adultery and then something more stacked on top of it, cruelty, desertion, bigamy, a whole additional offence to go with the first. The same single act ends his marriage and merely begins your paperwork. The double standard is written directly into the statute, where anyone who cares to can read it. Stacked on top of it has a shape. Once you see it on paper, you've gathered your evidence. You have proof of the adultery. A solicitor sits across from you at a narrow desk and explains with the calm of someone reading a train schedule that this alone is not sufficient grounds. You need a second charge. Cruelty will do, if you can prove it. Desertion will do, if he's been gone long enough. The bar for his side of the form is one item. The bar for yours is a list. The solicitor caps his pen. He doesn't say this is unfair. It isn't unfair to him. It is simply the law, written in 1857. still current in 1900 and not equalized until 1923. Meanwhile, in the United States, divorce law is less a system and more a series of local experiments conducted simultaneously by people with very different opinions about permanence. Most states make it difficult. Some make it theatrical. South Carolina bans it entirely until 1949, which is the legislative equivalent of a fire exit painted directly onto a wall. New York in 1900 allows divorce on adultery grounds only, full stop, which means a significant portion of New York divorces involve private investigators, rented hotel rooms, and semi-professional witnesses who have done this before. Mabel, the court-appointed stenographer, has heard everything. She is patient, unhurried, and entirely unsurprised. Nothing surprises her anymore. Nevada is the loophole other states accidentally build. Its 6-month residency rule becomes a market for escape. You move to Reno. You wait. You establish residency, which means renting a room above a saloon and becoming briefly, technically, a Nevadan. After 6 months, you file. After your hearing, you take the train home. What you bring back is a legal document your home state will grudgingly recognize in a mild sunburn. The Nevada divorce industry is basically a timeshare resort, except the thing you check out with is your freedom and the thing you leave behind is the marriage your home state refused to dissolve. Of course, getting to Reno requires money, and if you've been living under coverture, no independent bank account, no wages in your own name, no lease you could sign without a co-signature, the money question is genuinely complicated. You can't easily save toward a divorce you're not legally equipped to fund. The trap has a secondary trap inside it, the way certain legal documents contain footnotes that are themselves longer than the document. And lest you think a court order only ever runs in your favor, a husband could obtain one for the restitution of conjugal rights, the same mechanism that let Edmund Jackson have Emily seized outside a Lancashire church in 1891 and locked in his house until the Court of Appeal pried the door open. The law could compel a wife home as readily as it could refuse to let her leave. And then there is the question of the children, which is its own closed door. Under common law, children are the father's property. You leave, they stay. England's 1839 Custody of Infants Act introduces the tender years doctrine. Children under 7 might stay with the mother, but a mother who simply takes her children and goes faces potential charges of interfering with paternal rights. The children are not a reason to stay. The law treats them as one anyway. You cannot get a divorce where you live, so you start considering where you can. In several states, the courts will simply refuse to grant one. South Carolina will say no outright for decades yet. And so a whole geography of escape develops, and its capital is Reno, Nevada. 6 months of residence in the state, and Nevada will dissolve what your own will not. Thousands of women make the journey, taking rooms, waiting out the calendar, turning the end of a marriage into a question of timetables and train fare. The cure for your marriage is a 6-month lease. 6 months in Reno look like this. You arrive at the station with a trunk and a lawyer's address written on a folded paper, and you find, to your mild surprise, that the city has organized itself around you. There are boarding houses that specialize in waiting wives. There are lawyers whose entire practice is the 6-month clock. There are women from Ohio and Georgia and Massachusetts sitting in the same parlor doing the same arithmetic, and the conversation over breakfast has a particular quality, practical, slightly flat, the way people talk when they have already made the hard decision and are now just managing the paperwork. It is, in its way, a very American response to an impossible situation. Build an industry around the loophole. The cost of this is not small. You are paying rent in Reno and still legally responsible for a household somewhere else, or your husband is, which amounts to the same problem from a different angle. You have left a job, or you had already left a job when you married, because the marriage bar took it, and so the 6 months in Nevada is funded by savings, or by a sympathetic relative, or by a quiet arrangement you don't explain to anyone. The train fare alone is a week's wages for most women. Reno is, functionally, a timeshare, except the thing you walk away with is your freedom, and even that isn't guaranteed to stay yours once you get home. Because the state you came from doesn't always recognize what Nevada did. You return divorced. Your home state looks at the paperwork and raises one eyebrow very slowly. The legal status of a Reno divorce depends entirely on where you go afterward, and some women find themselves in a grey zone. No longer quite married, not quite free, which is a category the law had not fully prepared for and was not particularly motivated to resolve quickly. Meanwhile, back in the parlor, a woman named Mrs. Sedgwick is explaining to her boarding house neighbor, a Mrs. Webb from Cincinnati, exactly which judge moves fastest and which lawyer charges less if you already have the correspondence sorted, Mrs. Sedgwick has been here 4 months. She knows the judge's schedule by heart. She delivers this information seated, composed, and entirely unhurried, with the calm authority of someone who has memorized a train timetable and refuses to be impressed by it. The other thing nobody mentions on the train out, you still might not get what you came for. Nevada requires desertion or cruelty or something nameable, not just the slow comprehension that the situation is permanent and intolerable. The court wants a reason with a legal shape, and if your reason is more atmospheric, the years of diminishment, the specific quality of his silences, the way every door in the house opened slightly wrong, the judge will look at you with professional patience and ask if there is documentation. There often isn't. The official record contains only your failures, not their causes, and even a successful divorce doesn't return what coverture took. You walk out of a Nevada courthouse and you are, legally, a person again in the category of femme sole, an unmarried woman with her own legal standing. You can sign a contract. You can keep your wages. You can open an account without a co-signer standing next to you looking approving. What you cannot do is recover the years the law spent treating your existence as a subsection of someone else's. That part stays where it landed. You come into possession of a pamphlet. It explains, in plain and useful words, how a woman might avoid having a 10th child after the 9th nearly finished her, and possessing it, mailing it, or handing it to a neighbor over the fence can all be crimes. The Comstock laws have classed this kind of information as obscene, filed it on the same shelf as pornography, so that the knowledge of your own body's workings reaches you. When it reaches you at all, by whisper and by contraband, you read the pamphlet by lamplight, and then you decide where to hide it. Anthony Comstock was a postal inspector who, in 1873, convinced Congress to pass a federal law making it illegal to send obscene material through the mail. He personally defined obscene. The definition was generous. It covered contraceptive devices, contraceptive information, any description of female reproductive anatomy that might be considered instructional, and pamphlets like yours. 24 states passed their own versions. Comstock himself claimed, near the end of his career, to have destroyed over 160 tons of obscene material. 160 tons. Whatever your feelings on the pamphlet under the loose floorboard, you have to respect the thoroughness. In a practical sense, you are not a radical. You are a woman in 1900 with 8 children or 6 or 4, and a body that has been pregnant for a meaningful fraction of your adult life. The average married woman at mid-century bore between 5 and 7 children who survived infancy, which does not count the ones who didn't. Your doctor cannot tell you how to prevent the next one, not legally, not in writing, not by mail. He can, however, remove your ovaries if you become sufficiently difficult about the whole situation, and thousands of women in the 1880s and 1890s had that done on the theory that it would calm them. It did not calm them. It removed their ovaries. The pamphlet exists because someone decided the law could be outrun. Margaret Sanger will mail her own pamphlet, Family Limitation, in 1914 and flee to England to avoid prosecution. Before her, Annie Besant and Charles Bradlaugh were tried in England in 1877 for republishing a contraceptive guide. They were convicted. The conviction was overturned on a technicality. They republished again anyway. The pamphlet kept moving. Meanwhile, describing female anatomy in print for any purpose, medical, educational, journalistic, is legally precarious in ways that describing male anatomy is not. A midwife named Madame Restel built a New York business on contraceptive advice for decades before Comstock arranged her arrest in 1878. She died the morning of her trial. The pamphlet business had occupational hazards. Yours is smaller. You are not publishing, you are not mailing, you are hiding. The question is where? Under the spare linen is too obvious. Your husband's mother visits and has opinions about linen. Inside the cover of a devotional makes a certain ironic sense, but devotionals get lent. Behind the loose brick in the kitchen scullery, near where the coal comes in, the smell alone keeps most people at a respectful distance, and the brick doesn't announce itself. You wrap the pamphlet in oilcloth because the scullery is damp and the pamphlet is the most useful thing you own. A neighbour, Mrs. Fenton, who has had 7 children and the air of a woman who has quietly solved several problems the law would prefer unsolved, will sometimes meet you at the fence on a Tuesday. She is quiet, careful, and faintly defiant, and she doesn't say anything directly. She's been at this longer than you. The fence is just the fence, and whatever passes between you over it stays there. This is basically a supply chain, with the discretion of a locked drawer. It moves through back gardens, through church halls, and through lending libraries where a particular book always seems to be checked out by someone who doesn't exist. The Comstock laws won't begin to come apart until 1936, when a federal court rules that contraceptive information sent to a physician is not obscene. Full federal repeal won't come until 1970. For now, the pamphlet stays where you put it, the oilcloth holds, the brick does not announce. You try to ask a simple question about your own body, and you discover there is no polite room in which to ask it. The words for the female reproductive system are, under a broad enough reading of the obscenity laws, exactly the kind of words that get printed material seized, so they are not said at the dinner table, not said by the doctor in front of your husband, sometimes not said by the doctor at all. You are expected to manage an anatomy you are not permitted to name aloud. The silence around it is doing a great deal of quiet work. What the doctor does say is this. He says you are nervous. He says you are highly strung. He says the symptoms you are describing, and you are describing them carefully, because you have rehearsed this, because you only have a few minutes, are consistent with a general female excitability that responds well to rest. He writes something down. He hands the paper to your husband. You were not there for that part, technically, even though you were standing right there. The medical literature of 1900 is not short on words. It has terms for 17 varieties of male complaint and a working vocabulary for every organ that does not belong to a woman's pelvis. That geography goes unnamed, or named only in Latin so dense it functions as a lock. Your physician doctor. Hartwell, calm, courteous, and entirely certain, who nods at you with the particular sympathy of a man who has already decided, keeps a shelf of textbooks behind his desk. The spines face outward. The titles do not. Female complaints, uterine disorders, nervous exhaustion of a delicate nature. These are not diagnoses. They are cupboards into which an enormous range of entirely real things get pushed and the door shut firmly. Menstrual pain goes in the cupboard. Difficult pregnancy goes in the cupboard. Any question that begins with "what happens if I" goes in the cupboard, which the cupboard accepts without comment and does not return. Missis. Caro, the woman 2 streets over, asked her physician a direct question last spring, and he wrote "morbid curiosity" in his notes. She saw it upside down. He did not turn the page. And yet the information exists somewhere. It exists in the pamphlets that get seized, in the letters that get intercepted, in the back pages of publications with innocuous names like The Household Friend, which is not a household friend at all but is doing its level best. Women pass knowledge through the only distribution network that doesn't require a postal inspector's approval. Other women, speaking quietly, near a hedge, with one eye on the gate. This is how most things that are true get transmitted in 1900. Not through print, through proximity. None of this is accidental. The Comstock framework doesn't simply catch the pamphlets in the mail, it reaches into the conversation itself and removes the nouns before anyone can use them. You can't describe a thing you have no legal words for. You can't ask a question you've been trained to feel as shameful before you've finished forming it. So the silence isn't an absence. It is a structure someone framed, raised, and roofed, with the door left out on purpose. Of course, the men writing the law had plenty of words. The law has extraordinary precision when it comes to what you cannot say, what cannot be mailed, what cannot be described within 50 feet of a post office. That specificity required naming the things in order to prohibit naming the things, which is a kind of irony the law has never lost sleep over. You learn what can be known from what is left over, from the gaps in what the doctor doesn't say, from the particular silence that falls when you use the wrong word in the right company and someone changes the subject. The vocabulary of the body becomes a thing you hold privately, accumulated in pieces, never quite complete. You know more than you're supposed to. You know less than you need. You disagree with your husband, loudly or in writing, or simply more often than he would prefer, and you learn how very short the distance is between a difficult wife and a committed one. In much of the country, the paperwork to place you in an asylum requires 2 signatures, your husband's and one physician's. Yours is not among them and was never going to be. A man who wants you declared of unsound mind needs to convince exactly one doctor, and the doctor needs to write exactly one certificate, and the door of the institution handles the rest. The diagnosis that lands you there is hysteria, and hysteria covers a great deal of ground. It covers anxiety. It covers refusing sex. It covers assertiveness, excessive reading, and what one medical textbook calls a tendency to hold opinions. It is, in other words, a diagnosis with the structural integrity of a fishing net, wide mesh, catches everything, nothing slips out. Dr. Fairhurst, pen moving steadily down the form, ticks the box without looking up. The box is labelled nervous excitement. You have been nervous. You have been excited. The box applies. Elizabeth Packard was committed in 1860 by her husband, a minister, for disagreeing with him about theology. She spent 3 years inside before she got herself out. Nellie Bly had herself committed to Blackwell's Island Asylum in 1887 and found women in there who were perfectly coherent, committed by husbands who wanted to remarry or simply to stop paying support. The women she met weren't confused. They were inconvenient. There is a difference. The asylum was not equipped to honour it. The commitment process is, in the language of the era, a two-factor authentication. Both factors are men who find you difficult. You don't appeal the decision, because there is no mechanism by which a woman declared mentally unsound can demonstrate that she isn't, the declaration having preemptively addressed her credibility on that subject. It is airtight. It was designed to be. Once inside, the treatments begin. Potassium bromide, opium, months of bed rest during which you are not permitted to read, reading having contributed to the problem in the first place. For more serious cases, there is the ovariotomy, the surgical removal of the ovaries, performed thousands of times in the 1880s and 1890s as a cure for restlessness, irritability, and opinions. The ovaries, in the medical consensus of the period, are doing something wrong. The solution is to stop them. You wake up afterward in a room that smells of carbolic acid, and someone tells you that you should be feeling much calmer now. You are. You've just had surgery. Calm is not the word you would have chosen. Nobody asks which word you would have chosen. That is not part of the recovery. The physician-administered pelvic massage, offered as treatment for uterine hysteria, was common enough that in 1880 a doctor, Granville, filed a patent for a mechanical device to reduce the hand fatigue of the doctors performing it. This fact is in the patent. The patent is in the public record. Anyone could read it. Nobody seems to have found this arrangement worth examining particularly closely at the time, and the device went on doing the work that the hand had grown tired of. You don't have to be visibly difficult to end up here. Elizabeth Packard wasn't shouting. She was writing, keeping a journal, corresponding with friends. These activities, conducted without her husband's approval, constituted a pattern. The pattern constituted evidence. The evidence went on the certificate. You read this and think, I keep a journal. You are reading this in the year you are in, and you keep a journal, and the journal is yours. And that is because a very large number of women spent a very long time making it yours. They were not thanked at the time. You are diagnosed with hysteria, which is to say you are diagnosed with very nearly anything. The word stretches to cover whatever a woman does that a man standing near her finds inconvenient. Anxiety, sleeplessness, refusing the marriage bed, wanting work, wanting quiet, reading too much. There is no test for it, because it is not really a condition. It is a verdict wearing medical clothing. Once the word has been attached to you, your own protests against it begin to count as further evidence of it. The diagnosis is shaped precisely so that arguing with it confirms it. The treatments arrive in order of severity, though the order is flexible depending on the physician's confidence in your husband's patience. First, potassium bromide, a sedative that makes your hands slow and your thoughts arrive slightly behind your mouth, which is probably the point. Then bed rest, sometimes for months, which is prescribed as rest but functions more as storage. You lie in a darkened room. The room doesn't ask anything of you. That's the treatment. The logic of it closes around you like a door swinging shut. You were restless. The restlessness was a symptom. The cure is that you cannot move. If the restlessness stops, you have been cured. If it doesn't stop, you need a stronger intervention. There is no exit. A physician named Silas Weir Mitchell made bed rest into a formal protocol. He he called the rest cure. 6 weeks of enforced stillness, rich food, no reading, no writing, no visitors, no decisions of any kind. You are fattened and quieted, like something being prepared for a different purpose. Charlotte Perkins Gilman tried it in 1887 and later wrote that she came, within 3 months, close to losing her mind entirely. The cure was doing exactly what the illness was blamed for doing. Mitchell, hearing this, was reportedly unmoved. The therapy had a good reputation. It kept its reputation. Then the surgical option. Your ovaries are, according to the medical literature of the 1880s and 1890s, potentially the seat of the problem. They are excitable. They communicate poorly with the rest of you. The solution is an ovariotomy, a procedure performed thousands of times in a single decade, in which the ovaries are removed and the question of what they were doing wrong is considered closed. Dr. Robert Batty performed so many of these operations that the procedure briefly bore his name, Batty's operation. It was not a last resort. For some physicians it was a first instinct. You go in anxious, irritable, and opinionated, and come out surgically revised. The paperwork describes this as an improvement. Meanwhile, a physician named Joseph Mortimer Granville patents a device in 1880 intended to mechanize a treatment that had previously required a doctor's hands and a great deal of his time. The treatment was called pelvic massage. The device is electromechanical. It is, without any ambiguity, a vibrator, which makes it, in the driest possible reading, the first medical technology specifically designed to automate a physician's workload by removing a physician from the room. Granville considered this progress. He was not wrong, in a narrow technical sense. A nurse named Mrs. Goodwin sets a small brown bottle of potassium bromide on your nightstand without making eye contact, smooths the edge of your blanket with the flat of her hand, and leaves without speaking. This is the consultation. She has done this 6 times today. The bottle doesn't offer an opinion, but its presence is emphatic. Your husband has signed the paper. A physician has agreed with the paper. You are outvoted. You are the only person in this process whose opinion has been formally excluded from the process. The diagnosis doesn't require your participation. It only requires your presence, which you are providing. You are prescribed rest, and the prescription is a great deal heavier than the word makes it sound. The treatment for hysteria can mean months in a darkened room, forbidden to read, to write, to sit up, sometimes to feed yourself, dosed with potassium bromide or with opium, until the restlessness the doctors named has nowhere left in you to go. The cure is designed to produce a quieter woman, and on its own narrow terms it frequently works. You lie still because stillness is the medicine, and you wait to be declared well enough to return to the life that made you ill. Nellie Bly did not wait. In 1887, Elizabeth Cochrane, 23, a newspaper reporter, professionally named after a Stephen Foster song, feigns madness well enough to get herself committed to Blackwell's Island Asylum. She stops feigning approximately 30 seconds after she arrives because she doesn't need to keep it up. Nobody notices the difference. The asylum's operating theory is that the women inside it are there because someone decided they should be, and that decision does not get revisited. What Bly finds inside is not what the intake paperwork describes. She finds Tilly Mayard, who spoke 4 languages and arrived in good health and is now, several weeks in, genuinely deteriorating. She finds women who don't speak English, committed because they couldn't answer intake questions put only in English. The women she meets are coherent, lucid, and entirely unremarkable, not confused, not violent, and not unwell. They are simply there, and being there is treated as its own proof. Elizabeth Packard's case is earlier, and more direct. In 1860, Packard's husband Theophilus, a Calvinist minister with opinions about theological disagreement, has her committed to the Illinois State Hospital for the Insane. Her offense is arguing with him about religion. In Illinois at the time, a husband can commit his wife without a public hearing, without a court order, without any process at all beyond deciding to do it. She spends 3 years inside. When she's released, Theophilus locks her in the nursery and nails the windows shut. A neighbour eventually notices. The case goes to a jury trial in 1864, which takes 7 minutes to declare her sane. Packard spends the rest of her life lobbying for commitment reform, state by state, carrying a carpet bag of testimonials from women whose husbands had found the asylum a convenient administrative solution. She gets laws passed in several states. She is tireless in a way that would have gotten her recommitted a decade earlier. The diagnosis that sends women to these places has a remarkable range. Hysteria covers anxiety, it covers sadness, it covers excessive reading, which the medical literature describes with clinical concern, as though the alphabet were a toxin that builds up in tissue. It covers refusing sex, filed under inadequate domestic temperament. Margaret, a household manager in Coventry, is committed in 1893 after she tells 3 separate physicians she is fine and would like to go home. Her insistence that she is fine is recorded in her chart as a symptom of her condition. The chart does not see the irony. The chart is not built for it. The doctors who run these facilities are not, on the whole, deliberately malicious. This is not reassuring. They believe in the diagnoses, and they believe in the treatments. The rest cure is, in plain terms, storage. A woman set on a shelf in a darkened room, with the patience of a preserve put up for winter, taken down only when she has stopped fermenting. A physician named Horatio Storer publishes, in 1865, a serious medical argument that the uterus causes political opinions, that suffrage agitation is a clinical symptom traceable to reproductive pathology. The medical establishment receives this as a contribution to science. It is peer-reviewed. It sits in libraries. You are declared recovered when you have stopped doing the thing that concerned your husband. Not when you feel well, not when you demonstrate competence, clarity, or any measurable return to function. When the behavior that started the paperwork no longer presents, the paperwork concludes. Marta, a seamstress in Leeds, committed after she tried to open a post office savings account without her husband's knowledge, is discharged in the spring of 1901 with a note reading, "Much improved in disposition." She walks out carrying the same carpet bag she arrived with. The account is never opened. The carpet bag knows this. You are sent for a procedure. In the 1880s and 1890s, a popular surgical answer to a wife's hysteria is to remove her ovaries altogether, an operation performed thousands upon thousands of times, often on women whose chief presenting symptom is that someone has found them difficult. A gentler line of treatment exists too, a physician's manual pelvic massage, a clinical routine respectable enough that a doctor named Granville patents a small device in 1880 to spare his hand the labour. Both treatments rest on a single quiet premise about where a woman's troubles must begin. The premise is almost never said out loud. The ovariotomy is not rare. It is not experimental in the fringe practitioner sense. It is performed in ordinary hospitals by ordinary physicians, billed to the husband's account, and recorded in medical literature with the same tone used to describe a tooth extraction. The journals call it a cure for reflex irritation of the nervous system. The patient sometimes calls it nothing, because she is not consulted about whether it will happen. The decision has a different column on the form. The attending physician is a man named Dr. Marsden, mild-faced, always slightly damp around the collar, who schedules the procedure for a Tuesday because Thursday is his squash day. He has performed 43 of these. He is considered reliable. He washes his hands with the careful deliberateness of someone who knows he is being watched and finds it appropriate that he is. The instruments are laid out on a cloth, clean, polished, and precisely aligned. They are very clean. Cleanliness is a point of professional pride. There is also the gentler option, the physician's manual treatment for hysteria, formerly a therapeutic intervention for pelvic congestion, produces what the medical literature politely describes as hysterical paroxysm, which resolves the symptoms temporarily and requires repeat appointments. It is labour-intensive for the physician. Granville's 1880 patent addresses this. The device is clockwork-powered, brass-fitted and prescribed. It is also the reason your symptoms are on a weekly billing schedule. Medical innovation is not always what you expect it to be. The diagnosis that lands you here is documented in your file as nervous prostration with willful episodes. The willful episodes include crying when you did not wish to cry, refusing to cry when you did, declining to eat a meal you found offensive, and, this is the one that finally prompted the referral, reading after 9 in the evening without permission. The file does not include your version. The file has a single page. Your version would require more paper than is currently allocated to your case. What the medical record also doesn't include is that the woman in the bed to your left was committed for grief. Her name is Clara. She lost a child in April. By July, she was here, categorized under prolonged melancholic disturbance, incompatible with domestic function, which is a clinical way of saying she was still sad and the house wasn't getting clean. She doesn't speak much. She embroiders. Small flowers, wrong colours, slightly too large. She does it all day. Nobody has told her she'll leave. The potassium bromide comes on a tray at 6, and the tray has a cloth on it, which is a level of hospitality that does not extend to telling you what the bromide is for or when it stops. It sedates. It also suppresses certain cognitive functions, which is described in the literature as calming, and described by Clara as, "My hands feel like they belong to someone further away." The someone further away is doing the embroidery now. The flowers are getting smaller. None of this is underground. It is not a secret conspiracy conducted in unmarked buildings. The ovariotomy is published. The Granville device is patented, which means it has cleared a formal federal review process for novel mechanical inventions. The bromide is pharmaceutical. The asylum is licensed. The husband's signature on the admission form is a legal document. The entire apparatus runs in daylight, on letterhead, with receipts. The premise underneath all of it, that a woman's interior life is a medical problem with a physical address somewhere in her pelvis, holds together the whole arrangement. Surgeons don't say it. Physicians don't write it plainly. But the instruments are arranged accordingly. The cloth is clean, the bromide is measured, and the squash court is booked for Thursday. The tray arrives accordingly. The patent exists accordingly. Clara finishes a flower, holds it up. It's the wrong colour again. You are not the only sane woman behind these particular doors, and in 1887 a reporter sets out to prove it. Nellie Bly has herself committed to the asylum on Blackwell's Island, feigning madness at the gate and then simply behaving like herself once she is inside, where she finds women every bit as sane as she is, some of them placed there by husbands who wanted to remarry, or to stop paying for them. Decades before her, Elizabeth Packard was committed for disagreeing with her husband about theology. The institution does not require you to be unwell. It requires only that the right person says you are. The paperwork is short. Your husband's signature goes at the top. One physician's certificate goes underneath. That's the whole mechanism, 2 signatures, and a door closes behind you. 2 men who have decided you are difficult, 1 pen between them, and a corridor you did not choose. The form has no field for your response to these findings. The form does not have a second page. Elizabeth Packard had opinions about Scripture that differed from her husband Theophilus's, which in 1860 Illinois was a sufficient clinical presentation. Theophilus filled out the paperwork on a Tuesday. Elizabeth spent 3 years at the Illinois State Hospital before a jury, after she eventually forced a trial, spent 7 minutes deliberating and declared her sane. 7 minutes. The jury did not need long. They had met her. Nellie Bly's version of the story takes 10 days. A ward nurse named Vera hands her a tin bowl of cold porridge every morning, brisk, silent, and entirely unhurried, with the flat efficiency of someone who has long since stopped wondering about the people holding the bowls. The food is described in Bly's published account with the careful neutrality of someone cataloguing evidence. The bathwater is described the same way. The bathwater is cold, several women share it, in sequence. And you would be one of them. Sit on the edge of the iron cot, count the women between you and the single tub, and do the arithmetic of how cold the water becomes by the time the line reaches you. That is the part the form does not file. What Bly finds, and writes, is that the women on her ward are not behaving strangely. They are behaving like people who are frightened and want to leave. Some speak limited English and were committed because no one could understand their answers. Some were grieving. One had simply been tired, visibly and persistently tired, in front of a husband who found this inconvenient. The diagnosis absorbed all of them equally. Hysteria is a large container. It fits almost anything you put in it. Bly does get out. She has an editor. Her editor sends a lawyer. The lawyer arrives and she leaves with him, and her account runs in the New York World in October 1887 and causes a significant public reaction and a grand jury investigation and some reforms, and then, eventually, the reforms slow down and the mechanism stays largely intact. A husband's signature is still a husband's signature. The door is still a door. Elizabeth Packard, after her release, spends the rest of her adult life lobbying for laws requiring jury trials before commitment. She gets them passed in several states. She does this while her husband retains legal guardianship over her person. She does this while not being permitted to sign a contract. She publishes books about what happened to her under her own name, which her husband can legally claim the earnings from. She keeps going anyway. The embroidery is wrong-coloured. The work continues. You want to travel abroad, so you apply for a passport, and you discover you are not quite a person the document is willing to name on its own. A married American woman is not issued her own passport. She is written onto her husband's, a single line beneath his particulars, travelling across the border on his identity, the way she does most other places. To go anywhere at all, you need his consent and his paperwork, and the little book meant to prove who you are, proves, mostly, who he is. The arrangement will outlive nearly everything else on this list. The border is the easy part. You have to get there first, which means a train, which means a hotel, which means a desk clerk who looks at a woman arriving alone and makes a quiet judgment. Unaccompanied women at hotels in 1900 are frequently turned away at the front desk on the working assumption that a respectable woman would not be travelling without a man. And a woman travelling without a man is probably not respectable. The policy isn't written anywhere official. It doesn't need to be. The desk clerk simply informs you there are no available rooms, with the particular blankness of a man who knows you know he's lying and has decided not to care. You stand there with your bag. The lobby is available. The rooms are not. Harriet, a commercial traveller for a dry goods firm, has developed her technique. She books under her initials. H.M. Caldwell, not Miss Harriet Caldwell, because H.M. Caldwell sounds like a solicitor, and solicitors get rooms. She carries a letter on the firm's stationery, which she has learned to produce from her left coat pocket, slowly, with the quiet confidence of someone who has been doing this since before you were born. The desk clerk takes the letter. He reads it. He finds a room. Travelling on your husband's passport also means you cannot travel if he says you cannot, which is less of a logistical inconvenience and more of a complete structural barrier with excellent travel branding. The passport is not just a document. It is a permission slip that is also a leash that is also, technically, a compliment. You are included. After all, you are on the page. You are line 4. The passport is only the formal version of a much older arrangement. Your legal identity while married belongs to the marital unit, which in practice belongs to him, which means every official interaction you have outside your home involves, somewhere in the paperwork, a reference back to a man whose name you now carry and whose signature is the load-bearing wall of your legal existence. Opening a bank account requires his signature next to yours. Signing a lease requires his co-signature. Any contract you enter without his approval is voidable, which is a legal term meaning the contract is valid until he decides it isn't, which is less a contract and more a very formal request you've submitted to someone with veto power. So you carry his name through every door, the bank, the hotel, the border, 3 thresholds, 1 signature, none of them yours. The passport situation, specifically, will not be fully resolved until 1978. Not 1878. Not 1918. 1978. The year someone invented the roller disco. The same year a married American woman could finally apply for a document that named only her. These 2 events are unrelated, but it is worth knowing they happened in the same calendar year, because the timeline of women's legal personhood has a way of sitting next to ordinary history and refusing to move until you notice it. Meanwhile, back in the hotel lobby, H.M. Caldwell gets her room. She tips the porter exactly the correct amount, not too little, not enough to seem conspicuous, unpacks her sample case, and writes 3 letters before bed. She does not think of herself as brave. She thinks of herself as efficient. The room is small, plain, and faintly overheated. The gas mantle hisses softly near the window, throwing a yellow circle on the wall, muttering to itself like a lodger who pays no rent and has opinions anyway. She has learned not to close the window all the way. The mantle has opinions about ventilation, and so far the mantle has been right. You arrive in a strange city alone and you try to take a room for the night. The clerk hesitates. A woman travelling without a husband, a father, or a brother is, in the arithmetic of a 1900 hotel, a problem, possibly a prostitute, possibly a coming scandal, certainly a risk the manager would rather not file under his own name. You have the money for the room and a perfectly ordinary reason for needing it, and neither one quite settles the question your unaccompanied presence has raised across the front desk. You wait while a stranger decides what you are. The clerk doesn't ask outright. He doesn't have to. He simply adjusts his posture and says he'll need to check the register, which is a sentence that means nothing about the register. A Mr. Billings behind you clears his throat. A Mr. Billings always clears his throat. You watch the pen travel across the page and then settle nowhere while the clerk finds something interesting to examine at the middle distance. What the hotel fears is not you, specifically. It is the administrative inconvenience of you. A woman alone generates questions the ledger isn't designed to answer. Whose account? Whose name? Whose problem if something goes wrong? The room exists. The money exists. But a transaction requires two parties, and in the working legal grammar of 1900, you are only reliably one of them if a man has also signed the line. A woman who travels professionally has learned some arithmetic of her own. You book under initials, not a lie, technically, just a punctuation choice. A letter of introduction from an employer on firm letterhead helps, the kind with the small decorative border that signals institutional weight, Mrs. Partridge at the National Union of Women Workers carries both, plus a printed card that lists her title before it lists her name. The clerk folds when he sees the title. The title does the work that the money couldn't. Not every woman is Mrs. Partridge. The nurse travelling between postings does not have a card with a decorative border. The woman relocating after a divorce does not have a husband's name to lean on, which is partly why she's relocating. She stands at the desk and answers the same questions you're answering, which are not quite questions but function identically. The slow rotation of the register, the pause before the key comes off the hook. The hotel is performing a judgment. You are performing patience. The arrangement is administratively strange. The same hotel will rent a room without hesitation to a man who has not been asked to account for himself at all. His solitude is neutral. Your solitude is evidence of something. What, exactly, shifts depending on your clothing, your accent, and the cut of your coat. Factors the clerk will assess in approximately 4 seconds and feel entirely confident about. Some cities are better than others. Boston has a ladies' annex at 2 reputable hotels, a separate entrance, a separate register, a matron on the floor. Chicago's Palmer House has a women's dining room that functions as a kind of holding area between arrival and legitimacy. The infrastructure exists because the problem exists, and the problem exists because the alternative, simply renting you a room like a person, has not yet occurred to anyone responsible for policy. You get the room, eventually. Mrs. Partridge's method works, or the clerk shifts managers, or a sympathetic woman at the desk waves you through without ceremony. The key is heavy, and the room is small, dim, and faintly stale, smelling of camphor and someone else's hair pomade. The window looks onto a courtyard. The bed has been made with the tight, slightly hostile efficiency of a bed no one expects to enjoy. You sit on the edge of it and the springs announce you. Not bad, not welcoming, just aggressively present, like the mattress has been waiting for this conversation and is prepared to continue it all night. You leave the marriage and you want to take the children with you, and here the law is at its plainest and its coldest. For most of the century the children have been, in the strict legal sense, their father's, his to keep, his to claim, his to recover if you should carry them off. A newer doctrine has begun to soften this for the very young, the so-called tender years, but it is discretion rather than a right, and discretion can be overruled. A mother who takes her own children out of the house can be charged with interfering in another man's property. You pack a bag. You take the 2 children, one is 4, one is 7, and you walk them to your sister's house. This is not a legal maneuver. It feels like a Monday, but it is, under the common law, closer to theft than to motherhood. Your husband can petition the court for the children's return, and he will, in most cases, receive it. Not because he is a better parent, not because anyone has evaluated that, because his name, not yours, is the one written beside the children in every register that records they exist, the kind of register that keeps its own quiet account and never once looks up to see who did the raising. England's Custody of Infants Act of 1839 did introduce the tender years doctrine, the idea that very young children, under 7, might be better placed with their mothers. Caroline Norton, who campaigned for the act after her own husband removed their sons entirely as punishment for her leaving him, would have recognised the gap between the law on paper and the law in practice. The act gave judges discretion. It did not give mothers rights. A judge who had decided a wife was the difficult one, The disobedient one, the one who read too much, could set the tender years aside between one breath and the next, a pen lifting, a clerk noting it, the children's names moving back across the page to the father's column. Mrs. Fenwick, in the corner house on Marsden Street, understands this. She buttons her younger child into his coat with the concentration of someone memorizing the gesture, because she is the small bone button, the loop of thread worn soft, the way his chin tucks down to watch her hands. Her solicitor, in an office that is narrow, brown and faintly airless, smelling of pipe smoke and ledger glue, has told her the hearing goes badly for mothers who appear agitated. She nods. She buttons the coat. The child asks where they're going. She says, to see about some things. The father's claim on older children is more direct. A son over 7 was almost certainly returning to his father. A daughter could go either way, which is not quite as generous as it sounds. The mother has no enforceable right in either case. She has a petition, a hearing date, and whatever opinion the presiding judge formed of her character before she entered the room. If the children stay with him and he remarries, your replacement begins raising your children the following Thursday. You have no formal mechanism to contest this. You have visiting arrangements, if he is agreeable, which is a sentence that contains an enormous amount of information about who holds the leverage in the negotiation. Underneath the wig and the petition there is a simpler sum. Children cost money to raise, and under common law that bill was the father's, so the children went where the bill went, which was to him. From the bench it looks tidy. From the bottom step of the hearing room it looks like your son being entered on a ledger the way a horse or a freehold is entered, kept against the cost of keeping him. The asset is 4 years old and wants to bring his wooden horse. Reform came, as it kept coming, in increments slow enough to be frustrating and fast enough to feel, in retrospect, like progress. The 1873 Custody of Infants Act extended the tender years protection to age 13. Later amendments made maternal misconduct harder to use as automatic grounds for removal. By 1900, a mother's case is not hopeless. It is merely uphill, uncertain, and subject to the temperament of a man in a wig who has never met your children and will decide in 40 minutes where they sleep. You write something good enough to sell, and then you run straight into the question of whose name goes on it. As a married woman, your legal capacity to sign a contract is thin enough that a publisher's lawyer might pick at it, and your married name on a novel or a stage bill invites the legal trouble and the social kind both at once. So you reach, as so many women do, for a man's name or a set of bare initials, and you send the work out into the world wearing a disguise. The book earns its keep, you collect it sideways. A publishing contract is a binding agreement, and you can't fully enter one. Your husband can ratify it, contest it, or simply ignore it, and the publisher knows this before the ink dries. Some houses require his co-signature as a matter of course. Others don't ask, and don't want to know. The arrangement is politely understood on all sides and never written down anywhere, which means if the royalties stop arriving, you have very little to stand on in court. You have very little to stand on in court regardless, but the point sharpens considerably when the money is missing. Mary Ann Evans publishes as George Eliot. Charlotte Bronte publishes as Currer Bell. These aren't pen names in the playful, theatrical sense. They're structural decisions, the same way you'd decide which door to use when the main entrance has a lock you weren't given a key for. The initials do the work of moving through a world that would otherwise stop to ask whose permission you have. George Eliot's publisher knows who George Eliot is. The question is never investigated further. That's the arrangement. A woman named Frances sits across from a literary agent on Henrietta Street, and the agent is asking whether her husband has seen the manuscript. Frances taps the folder on her knee twice, adjusting her gloves with the focused deliberateness of someone who has already decided her answer. She says yes. Her husband hasn't seen it. The agent writes something in his ledger and asks her again what name she'd like on the cover. And Frances says a name that isn't hers, and they both move on, and nobody mentions it again. Of course, the money has to go somewhere. Royalties addressed to a George or an Ellis or a C. Something travel to a real address, which belongs to a real household, which has a real husband whose name is on the account at the bank. If you've arranged it carefully, if there's a sympathetic husband or a maiden aunt willing to receive correspondence, the money reaches you. If you haven't arranged it carefully, the money reaches someone else, and that someone else has legal access to it, because your earnings are his under most statutes, including the ones that haven't been updated since before you were born. England's Married Women's Property Acts, 1870 and 1882 did give wives the right to keep post-marriage earnings. This was considered a radical intervention. The papers called it an upheaval. What it meant in practice was that some of the money from your novel might remain yours, provided you can prove it was yours to begin with, provided the account is correctly structured, provided nobody contests the arrangement, and provided you aren't in a jurisdiction where the older rules still have teeth. The law improved, the teeth remained, and this is before anyone finds out you wrote it. A woman writing fiction under her own name in 1900 is a conversation starter at dinner parties, and not the kind you want. Critics will use the biology as the review. There are serious men with columns in serious papers who will tell their readers that a woman's emotional nature is too soft, too excitable, and too unsteady for the analytical demands of good prose, right below their considered opinion of your book, which they've just told their readers is quite good. You file this away, you keep the initials. You feed everyone, and feeding everyone is far closer to a trade than to a task. There is no tin to open and no dial to turn. There is a coal range that must be cleaned, blacked, lit, and coaxed before it will so much as warm a kettle, and there is a roast that wants constant tending and a sauce that wants endless stirring and bread that began the night before. Mrs. Beeton, whose book sits in half the kitchens in the country, calmly advises that a proper household keeps at least 2 servants for the cooking alone. You are, most mornings, all of them. The range has its own opinions. It is heavy, temperamental, and entirely indifferent to your schedule. It runs hot when you want low and sulks when you want fast, and it requires blacking every morning with a paste that stains everything it touches, including your judgment about what you thought this day would look like. The flue needs clearing, the ash needs drawing. The whole operation smells of iron and old smoke and something underneath that isn't quite sulphur but is doing its best. By 7 in the morning, you've already put in what a modern person would call a full workout, and nobody has eaten yet. Monday is wash day, and wash day is its own sovereign event. The copper tub comes out, water gets hauled and heated. Wool and cotton and linen go in together, none of them happy about it, and you wring them by hand because there is no other way. The kitchen fills with steam and a smell that is part sulphur, part wet animal, and part something uniquely produced by boiling a family's worth of undergarments in a confined space. By 10 in the morning, the whole ground floor is a weather event. The clean laundry hangs like a soggy government announcement that everyone must wait for. The range needs feeding again by noon. The bread from last night is ready, which means you've been managing something in the kitchen since yesterday, which is technically continuous cooking with a brief pause for sleeping near it. A Mrs. Wilkes, standing at this same coal range in a kitchen in Birmingham or Leeds or any kitchen at all, turns a roast with the focused expression of a surgical resident, then uses the same hand to wipe her forehead, then goes back to the roast. The roast doesn't thank her. The roast hasn't got the range for it. Mrs. Beeton's book runs to nearly 1,000 pages. It is, depending on your interpretation, either a comprehensive masterwork of domestic science or a threat delivered in recipe form. It covers everything from the management of servants to the correct temperature for a blancmange, with the calm authority of someone who has never personally had to black a range at 6 in the morning. The book assumes you have staff. The book assumes a great deal. You have the book, and you have the range, and the range is currently deciding whether it feels like cooperating today. Of course, the cooking itself is only part of it. There's the shopping that preceded it, done under agency of necessity, meaning your purchases at the butcher and the greengrocer are legally your husband's transactions, not yours. You are, in the technical sense, his agent in the marketplace. A purchasing agent who also does the purchasing, the preparing, the cooking, the serving, and the clearing. The agent who took no salary. The agent who couldn't sign the ledger in her own name. And if someone asked who was responsible for this entire daily operation, the range, the bread, the roast, the wash, the saucing, the timing, the feeding of everyone, the answer, legally, was that the household ran itself. You were part of it. Like the copper tub, like the flue, present and essential and not quite a person with a claim on the results. The range clicks and settles. Dinner is at 7. You have been cooking it since yesterday. You do the washing on Monday, because Monday is simply when the washing is done, and the doing of it takes the whole day and most of your strength along with it. The copper tub goes on to boil, and by mid-morning the kitchen is thick with steam and the sulphur smell of it, and you are lifting sodden wool and waterlogged sheets out by hand and wringing each one until your forearms burn. There is no machine anywhere in this room, and no part of the labor that anyone around you considers labor. It is simply Monday, and Monday is simply yours. What yours means is plain enough by mid-morning. Your hands are on the sheets. Your back is carrying the tub. Your morning is consumed from 6 o'clock forward by heat and weight, and the particular indignity of wringing a child's wool nightgown until it surrenders every drop. But the legal question of who owns this labor, the hours, the product of the hours, the physical cost of the hours, has a very clean answer, and that answer is not you. You are performing work inside a household that is not legally yours to own, for a family whose name you have taken in exchange for your previous legal existence, which was suspended at the altar the same morning you wore the good dress. The dress is gone. The legal existence went with it. The copper tub holds a full day's worth of a family's clothing, and it is your job alone to move it through the heat. Wool, cotton, and linen each want different handling and get none of it, because there is one of you and one tub and one fire that has to last until the last sheet is wrung. You haul the water, you feed the flame, you lift the sodden weight, and nobody counts any of it as work. Now, the steam. It doesn't stay in the kitchen. By 11, it has climbed the walls and dampened the ceiling and crept under the door into the narrow passage that connects the kitchen to the rest of the house, where it mingles with the coal smoke coming back down the flue. The smell of a Monday, wet wool, lard coal, and the faint sulphur note from water that has been standing in a copper vessel since before you were awake is heavy, sour, and entirely inescapable. Not a smell anyone notices except you, because you are the one who produces it. A smell that nobody else has to think about is, in its way, a very accurate description of the work itself. If you are injured badly enough that you can no longer do any of this, your husband sues for the loss of your domestic services, because the services are legally his, and you are merely the evidence. Mrs. Dugdale, your neighbour 2 doors along, appears every Monday afternoon without fail to collect her husband's shirts from the line before the light goes, folding each one with the flat, decisive motion of someone who has made peace with a situation she did not choose. She doesn't speak when she collects them. She nods. Her forearms are the same as yours. She has been doing this since before her wedding, when she was still a legal person, and she will do it long after, when she is not. By 3 o'clock the sheets are on the line if the weather allows, which it often doesn't in a northern English winter, which means they are draped over every horizontal surface in the kitchen instead, steaming quietly back into the room you spent all morning steaming out. The tub is empty. Your arms ache with the particular depth that means tomorrow will be worse. And none of what you have done today appears anywhere, not in a wage, not in a record, not in a contract, because you cannot sign a contract, and because this was not work, it was Monday. And Monday, as previously noted, is simply yours. Let's do the tally. Tonight you woke up unable to sign your own name, hold a lease, or keep the wages out of your own hand. You shopped as somebody else's legal errand. You read your own marriage announced in the classifieds, filed between the lost dogs and the rooms to let. You were turned away from the ballot, the bank, and the front desk of a perfectly ordinary hotel. You could be sent somewhere quiet on one signature and one doctor's note for the documented crime of reading after 9. Your ovaries were treated as a suspect. Your passport was a line printed underneath a man's name. And your laundry, the law was quite certain, was not work. You made it through all of it. Of course you did. You always do. Here is the part worth sitting with for a moment, gently, before you go under. None of this is ancient. It isn't a stone tablet or a faded woodcut behind glass. It is your great-grandmother's ordinary Tuesday, close enough to touch, close enough that the women who lived it held the whole household together with both tired hands and were told, for their trouble, that they plainly needed no protecting. So thank you for spending the dark end of the night here, with me and with them. It's the smallest kind of company, but it counts. And now the easy part. Let your shoulders drop. Let the blanket take the weight your arms have been carrying. Let the day go, unsigned, uncountersigned, and entirely your own. You have a door that locks from the inside. You have a name that belongs to you, and nobody anywhere needs a physician's note to confirm what you already are. You're fine, officially, legally, indisputably fine. Good night.